when we ask the question of like what is normal, or if we think about normality, that kind of thing, I think it's very much connected to some of those larger sort of structuring processes like colonialism and globalization and these sorts of things as well. They probably try and sort of push or achieve order where it might not naturally exist.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Idioms of Normality on Future Framed TV, the collective podcast series of Traces&Dreams. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Mason, and I'm joined today by Dr. Timothy Heffernan, the co-editor of a fantastic new book called On the Anthropology of Ambiguity, the Anthropology of Ambiguity. And he's also an author in the book. Dr. Timothy Heffernan from UNSW, welcome.
Thanks, Paul. Great to be with you today.
Thanks for joining us on the show. And let me ask you first, what brought you to the topic of ambiguity?
Well, I've always been very interested in, the sort of stuff that happens around us, and I feel like, in our world, we're often looking for order, for a sense of kind of what's normal, what's clear, what's knowable, these sorts of things. But I've always sort of felt that, that's not necessarily the way that the world actually works. There's a lot of ambiguity, sort of grey area, a lot of things like that. And I've always been really interested in trying to understand that further. What we can probably chat about a bit later down the track as well is that usually we're trying to sort of avoid things like ambiguity and disorder and insecurity and uncertainty and these sorts of things. But I feel like it's quite an interesting thing to look at, not necessarily to work out how it might be resolved, but also to work out the sort of the power of ambiguity and uncertainty. How it can be sort of manipulated or sort of capitalized upon and that kind of thing for different ends. So it's quite an interesting topic, but it's also something I think that the world is full of. So I've been really interested in the topic itself.
You've been brought to this topic as an anthropologist who's interested in studying the people, the places. That's
right, yeah. So I've trained in sociocultural anthropology, did a PhD, looked at, did an ethnographic case study on a national crisis in Iceland after the global financial crisis in 2008. So lots of uncertainty, lots of ambiguity there. That's probably where I really picked up on the topic, if I'm honest. And yeah, it's been something that I've been really interested in since, just the way that people are confronted with things like ambiguity, but also the way that might be resolved or not. Maybe it's sort of embraced, maybe it's avoided, that kind of thing. So like, what do people do with what they're confronted with in times of kind of disruption, crisis, disaster, that kind of thing? That's very much what I've been interested in as an anthropologist.
So asking lots of questions rather than jumping to conclusions about...
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, let me ask the question then. What is normal?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I see normal as referring to probably like a set of processes or ways of thinking or acting with reference to, our particular socio-cultural or socio-political context. So it's sort of the context that we're in. But it's very much, I think, understood as a way of ordering. I think the world, as I was saying previously, is not particularly ordered or sort of clear cut. There's many sort of different rhythms and patterns in the world, be it sort of the natural world or sort of like the sort of cultures that we inhabit as people as well, and also the ways that those cross over. And so I think that people look for patterns and sort of trends and things. They're looking for the kind of normal, the normality. But we live in a world that's kind of, that's a highly sort of contested word and sort of sense of being. So but I see it as a way of kind of understanding the world, fitting into the world, ordering the world, that kind of thing. I think it's also the result though of a large set of processes that kind of structure our world in a sense. So I think when we ask the question of like what is normal, or if we think about normality, that kind of thing, it's I think it's very much connected to some of those larger sort of structuring processes like colonialism and globalization and these
Mhm.
sorts of things as well that probably try and sort of push or achieve order where it might not naturally exist. So I think you see that with globalization where like the way globalization works, where things are, made sort of readily available everywhere for everyone, that kind of thing. And there's a sense of uniformity around products and services and that kind of thing. But also with colonialism as well, where particular dominating sort of cultures or groups might seek to sort of impose a sense of normality, which other people might need to sort of live up to as well.
I love that. In fact, I'm going to paraphrase it, but I'm going to do it an injustice in paraphrasing it because what you've given here is such a beautiful way to mobilize the concept of normality in a way that we can study how it rolls out, how it gets implemented and its effects on the world. Because you've said that normality is a set of processes that structures the world. And your fieldwork's in Iceland. Uh, do they have the concept of normality and how does it structure their world?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I feel like, for those who might not know the specifics of Iceland, I mean, it's a small island nation. There's about 380,000 people currently that live there. There's probably about 80% are sort of born in the country. So, there's a sense of, and they have their own language and sort of all of that as well. So it's kind of like this sense that it's a kind of small place with probably a really rich history and a sense of like the way that things go to the extent that when you go to small places like this, there's this kind of sense of you fit in or you don't in a lot of ways. So I don't know that there's a strict sense of like people needing to fit in and be normal in that sense. But I think by virtue of the place that it's small, with most of the population being Icelandic, being born there, that kind of thing. There's probably a sense of sort of order and normality in that. That if you're a tourist or if you're a foreigner, you might not necessarily understand the Icelandic world in terms of its sort of rich cultural history of the sagas and sort of this uh, you know harsh topography and climate that people live in. So it's quite different for a lot of people, and I think the normality comes out if you're able to kind of understand how to live there, understand the rich traditions of the culture itself, like that. So I think that as a small place, that kind of sense of normality comes out. Yeah, pretty quickly. But I don't necessarily think that it's sort of like imposed, as I was saying before. I think it's kind of like it's just what happens maybe in small places, and that there's an imposition in that. So
Interesting. Do you think that as you're talking, and you've written about how ambiguity can be constructed to hide problems or deflect blame, and I'm also just wondering if the concept of normality itself is also a little bit ambiguous.
yeah, so there's a little bit there. So I think I would say that I do agree that maybe normality can be ambiguous, and I think that's because despite the fact that a sense of normal or normality like that, despite it being often kind of imposed or a kind of standard that people hope to kind of fit within. I also think that it changes. It sort of can change through different things, and so there's a bit of ambiguity there about what might be normal now could be sort of not as normal later. It could be slightly different, or what might be normal here is not normal somewhere else. So there's probably a sense of kind of nuance and grey area there, which I think is quite interesting. But to your first point as well, I think what's particularly interesting with some of the work that I've been doing, which has been on crisis as it's related to the global financial crisis and its aftermath, but more recently as well with environmental disasters, particularly in Australia, is that often when something like a crisis or a disaster happens, it creates a lot of a large sort of sense of ambiguity. That sense of normality kind of quickly evaporates, I think, often because you're in a sort of unprecedented time. The recent past and the expected future kind of quickly change, and people are kind of left wondering, what's next, what's going on, how do we respond, and things are, quite unknown to an extent. So sort of normality flies out the window, and I think ambiguity, is quickly ushered in a lot of ways.
Let me stick on the topic of ambiguity then. Like, how has ambiguity been used in managing recent global crises, whether economic, environmental, or health related, and how does it serve to protect or exacerbate these situations?
Yeah, and thanks for the question. It's a really good one because it's one that that I and others throughout the book really explore. Because as I was just saying, with crisis, disaster, these sorts of disruptions that are occurring quite frequently at the moment in the last sort of couple of decades. What happens is, as I was saying, like that sort of recent past, that expected future flies out the window, and a sense of the unknown probably comes in. But I think that doesn't mean that people are kind of proactively being like, okay, what's next? Let's sort of build the future or whatever. Instead, I think that ambiguity can be sort of manipulated and used. Knowledge and sort of like knowing and not knowing can be kind of mobilized in different ways. A sense of ambiguity can also be mobilized in different ways. So one thing that we look at, that I look at in my chapter, but that other authors also look at, is the way that maybe ignorance is used, or the way that kind of knowing and not knowing might be used. So, for instance, one of the things I look at in my chapter, which is based on the economic crisis in Iceland, is the way that with global capitalism, and with sort of the sort of order of economics these days, quite when a disaster happens or when a crisis happens, people can quite quickly say, well, we're not really sure what happened, it all collapsed, this sort of thing. And there's so much detail that you can kind of hide in the detail, it's complicated, like this and this and this happened, and it kind of, and this then happened, so people kind of paint in these really broad brushstrokes these things that happen, and you kind of lose the detail. And through doing that, people can sort of avoid blame to an extent. So there's been a fair bit of research done on this after the global financial crisis, in the sense that individual economists or financiers or bankers or economists or even politicians, kind of thing like that, can kind of be excused of the blame for getting society or a country, whatever it is, into a big mess. It's kind of like, oh, well, I did this bit and then they did that bit. And so it's all, because it's all sort of like, no one can be fully blamed. It's sort of the system, it's kind of like that. And so people kind of use this sense of like ignorance, to their own advantage, to kind of avoid blame in a sense. So that's I think one of the really interesting sort of developments that I look at, but also that's looked at by other authors after the global financial crisis. And the other thing too is, I mean, one of the
hang on, press pause. You've just blown my mind.
Okay.
Like, you're just making me think, wow, bureaucracy is just one big way of creating ambiguity over responsibility.
Yeah.
That's such a great point. It's amazing. Like, you've suggested that normality is a set of processes that structures the world, but actually in diffusing responsibility across those sets of processes, we create those sets of processes create ambiguity about where normality is at, how these conditions are actually imposed. And before, when you were talking about Iceland, it was interesting. You said, it wasn't necessarily imposed, it sort of kind of emerged. And yet, so the origin of how that came about is diffused amongst those set of processes. I'm sorry to press pause on that, but I thought it was such a great point that
no.
We construct ambiguity in processes that are supposed to create clarity and transparency and due process.
Yeah.
But I don't want to distract from your second point. You were going to tell us about the
I was
next
just
thing.
going to follow up on that a little bit, and it'll take me into the second point too, which is that I think also, the economy, it's a big thing, big thing to talk about, a big thing to live within, that sort of thing. But the economy, it's one of those things where often as citizens, as people, that kind of thing, so not necessarily as economists, as people, we're sort of told, oh, there's this sort of future growth, this sort of future orientation that we're sort of working towards. Often, within a capitalist society as well, it's about, the growth of capital and that kind of thing. And we're all sort of being lifted together. And it's sort of this glorious sort of future we're heading towards, which will be great. Now, the thing with capitalism is that it's full of booms and busts. So things, new markets emerge or new sort of products emerge, and there's a huge boom around something, and then often there's a bust around something else. There's a very long history of this over centuries, actually, but I think across the last few decades, it's certainly been pretty evident as well. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that usually it's the economy and these sorts of things are often talked about as in there's this kind of clear line of sight of we're going forward together, and things are sort of on a sort of a future upward orientation like that. And then sort of to the point you were talking about around diffusion and things like that, it's like when things don't go well, it's like, oh, well, we're not really sure what happened, and sort of this happened and that happened and all these other things happened, and the detail sort of takes over, or the sort of complexity of it takes over, to the extent that we don't know what happened necessarily. We just know something went wrong. We don't know who precisely is to blame. We don't know how we'll get ourselves out of this. We don't know what the next big thing will be that might sort of lift us out of, this economic problem like that. So, there's sort of this really interesting sort of clarity on one end, and then sort of unclarity on the other end. And I think that that's sort of manipulated often during a crisis. But the other point I was going to make, which is related to this, and I guess this is quite sort of anthropological in a sense, or very much within the kind of the realm of the social sciences, where we love to take words and sort of flip them around and that kind of thing, or look at them from various angles. And so one of the other things that I've been quite interested in is the idea of failure as well. So there's this sense that that clear sort of future orientation I was talking about, that was sort of disrupted through whatever events happened, whatever decisions were made. And often that's seen as like a failure, something failed, the economy failed or something like that, or the politicians failed to sort of prevent this, or whatever it might be. And I think that's legitimate and that should be explored. But the other thing too is that failure can be an interesting concept in and of itself, I think, to look at. So in the book chapter that I wrote for the book, I look quite closely at the idea of failure, and look at like queer theory as well. So that sort of theoretical framework that I brought up within the chapter, because oftentimes, so with queer theory, often people are looking at, well, I should say, so with queer theory, often people are trying to queer taken for granted sort of normal concepts, like gender and sexuality and the family and the nation and politics and these sorts of things. So people are trying to sort of like queer them slightly to look at how they're actually constructed, or how they're seen to be normal, and what it would be to sort of be abnormal or different or something like that. So it can be quite a useful theoretical framework to sort of look at it from a different angle, or really sort of like untangle what is taken to be quite a secure concept. And so one of the things that I was looking at in the book chapter is the idea of kind of success and failure. So, in terms of a country, Iceland was sort of on this very successful trajectory at the turn of the millennium. They had sort of found a lot of success in banking. Historically, it's a nation that has mainly, the thing that the economy is mainly run on is things like fishing and imports and exports and that sort of thing. It's a large sort of service economy. It's a big sort of tourism economy these days as well. But at the turn of the millennium, there was this sort of really big turn to international banking and finance, and that some really small sort of commercial banks were expanded and extended overseas as well, and they did really well quite quickly. So again, that sort of boom thing I was talking about in capitalism, like quite quickly the sector was booming and doing really well. It was creating jobs and that sort of thing. It meant the economy was doing really well. And so, you've got this sort of like crisis that happens, and rightfully so, that's sort of seen as kind of failure. But when we kind of like look at failure from different points of view as well, it can actually be quite illuminating. So when we think about, so if I now move from the kind of country economic context to sort of the individual and their experience of sort of success and failure, you can see that within like a sort of capitalist neoliberal system, people are wanting to ride that wave and sort of like feel like their life is successful as well, like buy a house and sort of have a job and sort of like have savings, but sort of, spend money and these sorts of things. And these are all kind of markers of success to an extent, or at least, that you're keeping up to an extent, So when that doesn't work out, and this is what I kind of looked at in the book chapter, when someone makes like a kind of bad economic decision. So for instance, when the economy was booming in Iceland, a lot of people bought houses, usually kind of subprime houses as well. They didn't necessarily have the savings, like the deposit. They were given sort of risky loans, these sorts of things. Often they were given loans in foreign currencies, so that when like the economy around the world collapsed, that caused a lot of sort of difficulty in terms of being able to pay it back, because it was now in a different currency. They had to pay it back. So lots of sort of issues, but people were sort of sold the dream of, oh, well, you can also have a house, just sign here and we'll sort of give you this risky loan, it'll be fine. We're on this sort of upward trajectory like that. So when things didn't go well and people had sort of taken on these really risky loans, it's interesting to look at the way that people kind of felt like they were on some sort of, like with the national economy, they were also on some sort of upward, forward looking trajectory. And that's quite successful. Like that looks like success. But then when things fail, they also sort of experience a sense of failure too, in that, all of a sudden they now have this bad loan that they can't really pay off. They might lose the house and still need to sort of pay the loan, all these sorts of things. So it was interesting to look at the idea of failure from sort of different points of view, and look at how failure can actually be kind of generative as well. Like when you kind of sit in failure, you kind of contemplate things. You think about, how it could have been otherwise. I could have, I could have been a homeowner, or I could have paid that off and owned the house, kind of thing. So you've got this sense of how it could have been, but then you've got this sort of like awful reality as well. Like, well, but I'm here, And so it's this moment of sort of thinking. And one of the things that I've been looking at in the book chapter is the way that sitting in failure was also like an interesting position to think then about, like, how people might want to live their lives, how they might want to be as a society as well. Do we want to be this sort of hyper capitalist, like hyper consumption sort of society, or do we want to live differently as well? So, failure can be kind of an interesting sort of word and experience to kind of think about deeply.
It sounds like you're already flagging a second edited volume, The Anthropology of Failure. But I didn't ask you to hold up a copy of your book. Show us the edited volume, The Anthropology of The Anthropology of Ambiguity, sorry, up a little bit higher, edited by Manaz Ali Mardanian and Timothy Heffernan. A beautiful image on that front cover. Yeah,
so published by the University of Manchester Press. And we have what could be construed as quite an ambiguous kind of cover on the front. And I'll just read the back here. It says, and I'll hold it up, overwhelming ambiguity from all directions. Is this a satellite image of a desert dune, a nanometer scale bacteria, or a conceptual sculpture? This is in fact an ancient geological formation naturally carved on a sand rock from the Marengo Reefs Marine Sanctuary, Great Ocean Road in Victoria, Australia. So, Yeah, interesting as well that, what might appear to be one thing could actually be another, or you could be completely off track and it's actually this. So ambiguity can be quite an interesting thing to look at and to think about.
And sometimes ambiguity is created by the angle from which we're looking at something as well, right? Like if you were to take a microscopic image of a skin cell,
Mm.
you develop ambiguity over which organism that comes from. But you zoom out and the ambiguity disappears. But
Yeah.
sometimes you might be too far away as well. And it's ambiguity about what you're looking at, and then you zoom in and realize you're looking at planets and stars or something.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
and I like how you're using alternative lenses to question and problematize things, like turning to queer theory to question the concept of failure, which
Mm.
is quite interesting. And how does queer theory question failure? Because I mean, I can imagine look, don't let me fill the space. I want you to answer.
Yeah, so it's really fascinating, and I think queer theory could be kind of applied to many, many things. But so one of the, I guess the sort of the theoretical framework that I took in the chapter was to use queer theory, but also to look at sort of affect as well. So and I'll come back to queer theory more generally, but just to describe in the book, the way that, as I was mentioning, with that sort of upward trajectory that the Icelandic nation state was and the people were feeling, the sort of affective sense of like excitement and joy, and we're sort of moving forward, and things are going really well. So I was quite interested in the sort of collective affects of different time periods, really. And then, you've got this sort of crisis point and the sort of collective affects of, a really negative economic situation, which was really importantly, actually, to the argument, whilst it was a collective sort of transcendence, if you know what I mean, it was actually quite a personalized sense of kind of like crisis and failure after that. So, everyone's like encouraged to take out loans and to spend money and to do all these things because the nation state's doing really well. Everyone's got money. People have got access to sort of cheap credit and loans and that kind of thing, easily able to get these things. But when a crisis happens, it's all quite individualized. So, okay, well, now you owe this money, so please pay it back. You as Paul, or whatever it is, like that. So, the kind of the sort of aftermath is very individualized. Your job might be under threat and your house might be under threat, that kind of thing. Whereas, in the sort of jubilance and excitement of the sort of pre-crisis time, everyone was kind of, sort of really collective affect of things can't go wrong, and then they do, and then that's quite a personalized thing. So using queer theory is interesting because, I guess historically within sort of gender studies and queer theory as well, people have looked at as I was saying before, that the sense that what might be taken as normal as like something we can take for granted, like the body, sexuality, the family, sort of right and wrong, and that kind of thing, can really be turned on its head when you look at it through queer theory. And one of the things that people do look at, like I used it in the book, is that sense of failure. So I guess collectively, the queer community might actually quite, resonate with the idea of failure, sort of not living up to maybe, like a particular sort of gender or sexual identity, not necessarily like keeping stride with their non-queer counterparts in terms of like, dating and getting married and sort of like having children and these sorts of things. Of course, queer people also do that, but I just mean in terms of those markers of like the life course of success and stuff like that. So people, talk about failure in that sense of not living up to these sort of standards and norms that might be set for society. So that's the kind of way that that queer theory is looked at, like terms like failure.
One thing I like about it is that, if you take queer theory and take something like normality, and you see someone who's not meeting the expectations of normality, and then we might call that person, in inverted commas, we might call that person a failure to the standards of normality. They failed to adhere to those standards. But what I love about queer theory is then queer theory comes in and says, well, what are these arbitrary standards that we're holding people up against?
Yeah.
It gets you to question the rubric, not the person, which
Yeah.
is kind of interesting. As you were talking about Iceland and the crisis and the aftermath, I was kind of wondering, was there a push to return to normal? And what was the process of reconstructing normality, if that was a desirable outcome?
Yeah. So what I found really interesting in the research is that with that sort of upward trajectory that I was mentioning, and this isn't unique to Iceland. I think we all countries, all societies, all even groups within societies do this. You go along with things. So it's like, oh wow, the economy is doing really well. For a small island nation that's really vulnerable to inflation and to currency fluctuations and these sorts of things. There was this real sense of stability and sort of this sort of booming banking sector as well. So people kind of went along with it and were really excited. And one of my favorite kind of, I guess, quotes that I've read from the literature around the banking crisis in Iceland was that people, in particular, Professor Kristen Lofsdottir here at the University of Iceland, invokes Hans Christian Andersen's story of the emperor has no clothes. So, people were kind of going along with this, and all of a sudden, someone just says, he's naked. Like this isn't a thing. There's been this big crisis where it's undeniable now that that the economy is in dire straits. And that's going to have all these repercussions collectively, but also for the individual in terms of like the ability to keep a job and to pay off debts and to live like a full life and all this sort of stuff. And so I quite like that kind of reference because it shows that you couldn't go back to normal. When someone says something that you can no longer deny it. It's kind of like, oh wow, like we were fooled into thinking that this was going to be this sort of like this sort of future-oriented, long-term kind of progress and success. That was actually, in truth, like through a lot of investigations, as the sort of Icelandic miracle, as it's been called, is actually kind of based on kind of like fraudulent practices, like a lot of hope and a lot of kind of sort of improper sort of banking and the sort of subprime lending that I mentioned as well. So a lot of shortcuts, a lot of things that as soon as danger spread throughout the global economy meant that it was just doomed to fail all along. And so as soon as people realized this, as soon as people realized that politicians had allowed this thing, that bankers had kind of fooled the nation, and kind of sort of encourage people to spend and do all these sorts of things, you couldn't go back to normal. There was this sense, especially in a small society, that people had actually sort of done the wrong thing by the population. They'd been led to believe these things, and then they'd been sort of left with a crisis situation that they didn't necessarily cause.
Am I right to understand that it's a great analogy? In fact, I've used the emperor. I didn't. It's great to hear that other people are using Hans Christian Andersen, because I've used it in my own, drafts and stuff. But I've questioned whether or not it would be well received by the general public for an academic to talk about fairy tales and the actual the usefulness of them.
But sorry, just to cut you off, I mean, it's a fairy tale, isn't it? This sense that like it's all happening, it's all great, and then that's exactly what it was. It was never going to last. So anyway, sorry.
The dimension that I love that you're bringing to the fairy tale is, and yes, a good point on the fact that it is a fairy tale, and we are subscribing to it, and then someone calls it out as a fairy tale and says, "Well, hang on, he's naked. The emperor's naked." But what your anthropological analysis has shown is that, or your observations have shown, is that people still desire the emperor's new clothes, even after someone has pointed out that the clothes weren't real. And yet people are still left with the desires to want those clothes. And so why do we want to clothe ourselves in these fairy tales? Why do we want to clothe ourselves in these falsehoods? I don't know if you can answer that question. It's tough.
Yeah, I mean, I could probably offer a few thoughts. And I think affect studies and queer theory, these sorts of things, have tried to sort of tap into this. So I'm thinking here with Lauren Berlant's work on like cruel optimism, the way that we feel like this thing could be the thing for us, like I'm going to vote for Trump because like like this could be a thing, or like I'm going to lose all this weight because then I'll be the person I want to be, or I'm going to like take up this hobby because I feel like that's the person I want to be, kind of thing. So people kind of have these affective attachments to maybe some kind of future-oriented sense of self, or at the sort of collective level as well, like this sort of future sense of like how we'll be, and we'll be better off for that kind of thing. So there's been a little bit done in sort of affect studies and queer theory on that, and people really subscribe to it because they think like I'm not or we're not quite there yet, but if we do this thing, we could be it, and it's really problematic. But one of the interesting things, which I haven't really written about before, but was really clear during the field work that I was doing in Iceland. So a lot of it happened. A lot of the field work was undertaken in 2017 and 2018. So it was about a decade after the banking crisis, and people talked about 2017 in particular being kind of a bit of a return to the pre-crisis years. So from sort of 2008 to 2016, it was pretty dire, but probably from 2016, there was a lot of tourism, like in the order of like 2 million people coming to Iceland, a population with 380,000 people. And so there was a lot of jobs created. There was a lot of money coming through the tourism sector. And what was really interesting in the crisis years, or in the sort of aftermath of the crisis, people were saying, "Oh, we need to sort of like find a new collective ethics. We need to sort of reform politics, reform the economy. Come together as a nation and be better, essentially." But then what was quite interesting was then when the money started to flow again. People weren't necessarily spending like they had been a decade earlier, but I think they were beginning to daydream again, being like, "Oh, wouldn't it be great if we could do this?" So, for instance, I remember conducting a few interviews in people's houses. I also got them to do a timeline for me, which I've got an example of in the book chapter, of the things that they saw as important to the crisis and the kind of markers of recovery. And what I found really interesting is that a few times I was conducting these interviews, and in the background, someone's getting like a new kitchen installed, or we're in like this like half renovated house or whatever, because it seemed like a decade later, people were beginning to think again about like consuming and about spending, and maybe about like, doing like being, on the precipice of being the person or being the society that they kind of want to be. So there was kind of this return, but for a clear decade there were a lot of big questions about like, how do we want to be as a society? How do I want to be as an individual? To the extent that in Iceland, they rewrote the constitution, to sort of like come up with a new sense, like a new sort of like framework of being as a population, very much rooted in sort of equity and the future as well, doing things now that will benefit future Icelanders and things like that. Sadly, it hasn't been legislated. Went to two referenda, and it got overwhelming support, but conservative parties kind of shelved the bill, so it hasn't been legislated. But that was just an example of like the deep thinking that was happening about how they wanted to be, what they wanted the new normal, in a sense, to be after the crisis.
The tremendous amount of work, but then also the fact that it just gets shelved is kind of itself very interesting, because it reinforces the idea that even after people have been able to point their finger at the fairy tale and call it out, people will still go back to wanting the fairy tale script.
Yeah.
Really telling, really interesting. Really fascinating fieldwork, and so many questions that I'm left with, and I think the book chapter's only going to intrigue me more. What questions do you think we should ask about the fairy tale?
Yeah, well, I think we should. I'm sure a lot of your listeners will, like some of them will come from a sort of academic, intellectual background. Others will be the general public. But I think in general, we should be really skeptical, or at least sort of try and take a bit of a critical eye to these things that feel like fairy tales. The things we think of markers of success, or the sort of future-oriented ways that we feel like we need to move in. I mean, that can be really self-fulfilling and really sort of like, really good for people. But I think we also need to think kind of critically about what it is we're moving towards, what it is that will sort of bring. But equally so, I think we also need to think really critically, or at least kind of like sit and think with like the concepts and terms that we use. These days, everything is talked about by politicians and the media as being in crisis, or sort of unprecedented, uncertain, these sorts of things. But as we've discussed today, and as you will have discussed many times on this podcast, I mean, like, what is certainty? What is normality? These sorts of things. And so often in the media, politicians, but also just lazy when we get lazy in our conversations, we tend to resort to these words. And I think that we should be kind of critical about them. The same that we should be critical about like what failure actually might be. What is success? What is failure? What is certainty? What is uncertainty? What is sort of clarity? What's ambiguity? Because I think we will be quite surprised to learn that even though something feels dire and crisis-like and all these sorts of things, and can have really tangible effects, don't get me wrong, I'm well aware of that, but it can also be like the start of something new, or it could be, a sort of the bend in the road kind of thing. It can also be an opportunity to, as was seen in Iceland, like create a new sort of national framework in terms of the constitution. It can be a moment of change and transformation and that kind of thing. So I think that these are things we should continue to think about.
Well, heaps of ideas for us to think about, and thank you so much for your time, Dr. Timothy Heffernan. We've enjoyed chatting with you on Idioms of Normality on Future Frame TV, the collective podcast series of Traces, Dreams.